and just speak normally. So I've walked around to see whether it picks up voices. It seems to fairly well, so I won't really worry beyond that. I think today all I'd like to do is talk a little bit generally, but I'd like also questions and feedback and discussion, because I'd like to keep this in the present and at this level, at the heart level, about what we're doing and about what we're talking about, rather than giving any sort of pre-planned talk. It's about Druidry, about shamanism, about medicine and associated things like magic, alchemy, astrology. I'm sure they'll all come into the mix because there is a considerable degree of overlap between them all. So all I intend to do today is just open up the discussion principally about Druidry, shamanism, and also because most of us are here with a healing focus, so where medicine may be fitting into that. I'd like to keep it to the sort of conceptual things. I know we've all got in the public arena lots of things happening, but let's keep those relatively out of it. They're for general discussion rather than any specific discussion. Yeah. Things I'd like to say at the beginning is terminology. I tend to avoid using the word psyche because I think it's been debased and been made material in things like psychology, psychiatry, and it's tend to become equated with mind. And I think that's a problem, the way we use the term. So if I use the word psyche, I'll tend to use it as a prefix, like in psycho-spiritual or psychoerotic or psychosocial or psychically experiencing. So I tend to use it like that rather than as psyche equals mind. Yeah, because truly, historically, from the Greek, it means soul. So when I'm referring to the soul, I'll be referring to the soul. So that kind of begs the question, where do we leave psyche? I think psyche is basically an overlying principal way of looking at areas that include body and mind and even the soul. So there's like a personal level to the psyche, which is equates more to things like the soul. And there's a more transpersonal, impersonal, objective level to the psyche, which is more spiritual in nature, archetypal, if you're used to those sort of phrases. Yeah. That's the general framework in which I use those terms. Mentality, I mean literally that, because mentality is, for me, to do with the rational, logical, technical, mechanical aspects of our being, where we use the non-physical aspects of ourselves in this reality. So that's where I tend to see the mind and mentality in general. Otherwise we get confused. I've been around and around the mulberry bush with this one, and this is the best I can come up with for myself. I'm not claiming it's the way we should all use it, but it might give you a little bit of an understanding when I do use those terms about the way in which I'm using them, and it might help you when you're using those terms be a little bit more critical about other people who are using them, because sometimes they throw them around in a way that sort of implies knowledge, and sort of it can be a little bit of a power trip. Like, oh, I wonder what they mean by that. Oh, I find the word spiritual, for example, to be a little bit difficult, because I think it's the expression of what someone like Tillich calls the ground of being into the world. It's the flow into the world, the Holy Ghost, if you can use a Christian term. But it's not all of what spiritual means. There's more to it than that. There are things ineffable, things that you can't talk about, things that you can't name. Yeah. So let's be a little bit clearer about terms. Second thing I'd like to mention before we start is I tend to equate thinking with the brain, with the mind, and feeling with the heart and with the soul. And one of the reasons I prefer discussions, questions and answers is that it can be at that level with people responding to what they're listening to in the moment and asking a question that comes up, rather than me giving a pre-planned, thought through, more intellectual approach to a topic. And I wondered why it was for many years why I found giving lectures so difficult, yet giving discussions like this so comfortable. And then when I listened to recordings, I found that there was a difference in quality for me, that the discussions were a lot easier. So when we get into this, let's basically leave it open. If you feel to ask any questions, do so, and let's have some discussion around it. If I feel like it's getting off the point, I might sound a bit brutal, but I'll pull it back and move on, or ask another question, so that we can just cover this sort of territory. What I'm hoping this discussion will do also is to fertilise further, probably more specific discussions. I mean, Druidry, medicine, shamanism, magic, astrology, alchemy, huge topics, huge overlapping topics. So in a way, I just want to give a more general orientation to particularly Druidry and shamanism from a more healing, health, medical perspective today, with a little bit of input from other areas. Yeah. I think the first thing, I wrote a paper, and I'm willing to share this, anybody who wants it. It's called Shamanic Medicine, which I delivered to a conference about 2 or 3 years ago, until they asked me to write it up to get it published, and that became just impossible. Make sure you use the right font. I use the right references. I don't know whether anybody of you have been through this, but academia can be so anal. It can be, absolutely. And I said, no, just leave it out. So I explored the concept of shamanism in medicine, in modern medicine, and what that meant. And what I did was went back to a definition of medicine, literally from the dictionary, because I often find that words and dictionaries can be a really powerful way of exploring concepts. It's called etymology. You can chase things and chase words where they come from. Some of the words that we're using, for example, in our particular structure, like the Nemetons, are based on particular words being chosen because I think they have significance. They may not be right or necessarily historically from the right context, but you've already gathered that I've chosen the word Nemeton as opposed to grove because there's a particular way they're perceived in the public, and also because Nemeton for me carries more of a spiritual context, in that there's often a shrine or some other object of significance in it, as opposed to a grove, which is often just a clearing or a communal space that's given sanctity. So they're both sacred spaces, but one's probably got a little bit more emphasis for ceremonial and ritual purposes than the other. And that, I think, is parallel to what we're talking about. Anyway, back to medicine. Medicine's often defined 3 ways, and it's this is in the dictionary. The first is as medicine as a practice. Right? It's the science of medicine. Diagnosis, prognosis, investigations, all that stuff we're familiar with is often lumped together and being seen as medicine, right? But it's medical practice. It's the way you practice a particular approach which is governed by other principles, philosophical, historical, traditional, call it whatever. And it's got flavours, like the one we've accepted as being the dominant one in our society is modern, Western, scientific medicine. So that's the yardstick around which others tend to get judged, rightly or wrongly. And there's a mixture, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, sometimes a mixture of both. And there's a lot of argument around at the moment about the degree to which it's valid that we look at medicine purely, rationally, technologically, scientifically, diagnostically. And I've certainly got disagreements with all of them. And I'm sure you do, at least with one or a few of them, because I know your views. But what I'm trying to do is also, with some of your views, is to get you to see how what you're negotiating with is going to be a force in its own right to deal with, and how you might be able to find better ways of negotiating with it. Like often when you're batting your head against a brick wall, it's easier to find a way around it. Yeah, that's one way of looking at medicine. Second is looking at it as a medicine, something you give to someone. Now again, we've been given the modern view that that's governed by pharmaceutical medicine, right? So that is what most people think of when they think of a medicine. Right? They think of a pill, a drug, something scientific, something that's been through evidence-based studies, statistics, has been approved. I mean, you've only got to look, and I'm going to mention this word once, I hope, vaccination at the moment, and the way that's going through that mill of authority views and statistics and evidence-based and outcomes and bad reactions, and the way that's probably being doctored or tailored or conveniently given to us in particular ways. Yeah, because again, there's other ways of looking at medicine. And medicine can be other physical things. Herbs are an example. Modern derivatives, homeopathy is another way. Other things can be a medicine as well. A feather can be a medicine. A ritual can be a medicine. You know, a tree can be a medicine, because if it's got significance for you, then it has a healing capacity, then it is medicine for you. Yeah. Is that clear? Yeah. So we've got restricted ways of looking at it. Now, the third area of looking at medicine in the dictionary, which is really intriguing, is looks at it as a spell or as a charm. And it conveniently says, but this is really confined to the North American Indians, and basically forget it. So we'll ignore that and go back to the others. But it's got to do it in, because there is an extant group of people of animistic background, if you like, of shamanic tradition background, if you like, who have a system of medicine, in spite of that post I put on Facebook recently. But that was partly a bit of a dig about all this sort of stuff, where they call their elders or their leaders or their medicine people medicine men and women. Yeah. So they're shamans, the people who do, and their medicine men and women aren't just medical in terms of dispensing healing techniques. In fact, it isn't often them that do it. They're often involved with rituals, ceremonies, holding the seasons, doing things that are periodic and significant. Yeah. So if you go through those critically, then you start, particularly the third one starts to lead into all sorts of interesting areas, because you're starting to look at things like spells. If you're using rituals, you're starting to look at the use of words in chants, enchantments, starting to look at charms, starting to look at talismans, amulets, starting to look at that whole area. And I just find it really intriguing or interesting that it's been relatively confined and ignored. So in the paper, what I did was reverse the order, and said, if we reverse the order, what are we actually looking at? And if we reverse the order, then we've got much more of a shamanic way of looking at things. Yeah? How's things so far?
I really want to move in that direction.
Sorry?
I want to move in that direction. I want to move away from the other two.
I think a lot of people, I think there has been, my experience of Western medicine is that there's been an undercurrent that's been gaining in strength in the, how many ever years I've been involved with it, nearly 50 now, where there's been increasing groundswell of discomfort with Western medicine. And
if I was really beat up in a car accident and I needed a ton of stitches and broke a bone set, sure. But from all other perspectives, it just hasn't cut it for me.
I heard it from someone still in practice not so long ago, and certainly my view of being in practice is that Western medicine is probably most valuable in areas of accident emergency. And beyond that, it's questionable. And that question, the further it goes away from dealing with acute problems of trauma and distress and pain and suffering, and the more it gets involved in diagnostics and prognosis and social problems and all the rest of it, the more problematic it gets. And I certainly concur with that. And I know a lot of colleagues who also have discomfort working in it. But as you probably know, they're not in a position where they can be public about it, because being public about it risks your registration process, quite simply. It's a very nicely packaged system where the only people who can speak about Western medicine are ones who are given the authority to be able to do so. It's different in other countries, but in Australia it's basically state sanctioned. So the people that you see on television are the people who are promoting Western medicine's viewpoint, exclusively. And it's worth bearing that in mind. Did anybody watch the Open tennis last weekend?
Oh, with the booing.
The booing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did anybody see the clip of the booing?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that at a particular event like that, it just took one simple comment to trigger a reaction to the way about vaccination and also about government's management of medicine. Now, the people in those seats, I think, would have been paying several $100s. So we're not talking about left-wing radicals. We're talking about people who went to the tennis and paid a lot of money to see a final. Yeah? And that, for me, indicates, if you like, the undercurrent that you're talking about. And I think there's a sort of... My role in that is also to say there are other ways. There's other ways around this blockage. We can deal with these things in other ways. Don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It could be useful in various ways. If I get in a car accident, yes. If I'm, skiing down a slope and I hit a tree, great. Orthopedic medicine will do me. But fixing up a sore shoulder, nah. It's relative. But we don't have a critical lens on it. So what I'm finding at the moment is that there are too many positions that people take it that are adversarial. They're fighting the system. And if you fight that system, you're probably, for the time being, going to lose. And there's going to be a fair amount of martyrs on the way. I mean, it may get to that point and it may ultimately work, but it's probably going to work better by people making inroads and discoveries that get beyond that then make what they're promoting obsolete. So because if they're obsolete, they'll quietly bring them in. Yeah. And that's the natural way of dealing with things. In Jung's terms, this is archetypal. That if medicine is no longer serving the archetype of healing, then other people who've got natural abilities to be able to do so will start cropping up in the community. The naturopaths, the chiropractors, the old farmer down the road who knows how to manipulate backs because he's done a sheep for it so long. All those sort of people with natural gifts will come out of the woodwork.
That word's really important to me, the difference between cure and heal. That's become really significant to me.
In what way?
You can cure something, but have you cured it for good? Have you taken away the problem? Have people really come to an understanding of what caused that problem in the first place? That isn't just fixed with a chemical, a synthetic chemical. If you heal, do you really encourage people to be responsible for their own? They don't just go to a doctor to get cured for however long. I want to be responsible for my own healing.
Which means your own health as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which includes things like keeping a disease if you want to, and dying if you want to. Not necessarily having those taken away from you. Yeah?
I did actually post that not so long ago, probably in the more argy-bargy way, but it was, I'm not afraid of this disease, and I'm not even afraid of dying. I stopped being afraid of dying when I understood that I go on afterwards. I don't know how yet, that's all mystery, and I've learnt to embrace mystery.
I think what you're coming to is where I was leading at in the paper by turning the medical thing around and saying, how about looking at it in terms of the words they're using, like charm and spell, and that if you're looking at it from a more magical element, I know they were doing it to try to pass judgment on those elements, because the more conventional notion of things like magic is not real. And things like enchantment indicates things like power and control over people, which is a bit of an irony because it's a bit like the pot calling the kettle black, I would think at times. Anyway, having said that, I think it shows a total misperception and probably misunderstanding of what that part of the definition is all about. And I think that's what troubles people. It's what troubles doctors as they get older because they see more of that. It's what troubles people in particular areas like psychiatry because they're dealing more with those realms than someone like an orthopaedic surgeon, for example. And it troubles people when they have a disease and they have it cured, that they're still dependent on doctors or tests or outcomes, that somehow something's missing in the curing process, which you're talking about with healing. Establishing a healthy or a healing approach to it, which includes the things we're talking about. So I think that's all embedded in that third area, which is the one I wanted to highlight in the paper. And so let's just turn it around to do that, rather than sort of using that to attack the medical model. And you can do it quite conveniently without necessarily getting into an adversarial way and say, yeah, a medicine is a pharmaceutical. Yeah, that's one, but there's also herbs. Yeah, but they don't. Well, what's the evidence? Has anybody? Well, there's no evidence, and there's no evidence because it's not submitted itself to the same sort of criteria that you use to judge the efficacy of what you're doing. But if you go to a traditional society, and you can give classic examples of that, like tobacco causes cancer. Oh, okay. Well, how come it doesn't in indigenous societies that use tobacco for ceremony? What's the difference? Because we know what that's pointing at. I mean, I don't need to state the obvious, but it's also indicating the flaws in the arguments, which is often a better way of actually opening up discussion. It's not necessarily you're wrong, because then you're basically at the coalface. You're in a war situation, but pointing out other ways of looking at it, and that's what I was trying to do in the paper. So let's just turn it around and sort of say, well, medicine's got some difficulties. Maybe some of the difficulties because it's kind of strayed away from being the sort of picture of medicine that people want. And the sort of picture of medicine that people want is one that's more holistic and archetypal. So, you're just the one who's saying that could be the answer. And this is, yeah, but if you look at traditional societies that do that, they don't have the same discomfort with their healers the way we do. They're not at war with them. They draw on them and they draw on what they're doing. So what are they doing that's different to what we're doing? Because most people, obviously, as displayed by the Open Championship in Victoria 2 weeks ago, well, a week ago, whenever it was, said they don't trust the government and they don't trust vaccines. There was a big noise there about that. Now, we've been given a huge amount of all the things that are supposedly meant to satisfy us about that, but it's not working. Anyway, shamanism. What criteria do you see makes for a shaman or makes for shamanism? What sort of things would you look for? What qualities?
Connect to community.
That's probably a spiritual perspective. Let's try and keep it more specifically to the shaman as a dignitary in our society. What qualities? You mentioned one.
Healing.
Yeah, but you mentioned it about yourself, didn't you?
Spiritual.
That you'd been through your own process of coming to terms with...
Responsibility, self-responsibility.
Yeah, but how do you become responsible?
Own it.
How do you own it?
Admit it or acknowledge it.
Go a little bit more into your own experience. What is it that's given you self-responsibility?
Failure of something else.
Or discovery of something that's worked?
So much more to learn about it. I don't know why it's worked.
Can you give another name to that process? Or would you give another name to that process?
It's experience.
The experience of? I'm being pedantic. It's simple. I'm not trying to be complicated here. Experience of. What's the main thing that creates lack of health in you? I'm well, then I don't feel well. What happens?
Disconnect.
Mm.
Disconnect.
Distance.
Disconnect.
Disconnection.
Yeah.
Some sort of trauma.
Okay, let's go with trauma. How are you when you get traumatized?
Think straight.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Can't think straight.
Distressed?
Distress.
Yeah.
I'm just getting simple words with this, right? Because if you start to look at them, if you start to go from a position where you're feeling whole to one where you're not, something's interrupted. There's a process that's gone on. Something's interrupted. You are okay, then something happens. It can be in you, it can be a dream, it can be something happens to one of your kids, it can be something you watch on TV that creates distress.
Could I'm thinking of something that happened yesterday. So Friday was my daughter's father-in-law's funeral, and he took on 4 children from a previous relationship plus one other, and he treated them all as his children, and one of them was in Victoria and she couldn't come, or New South Wales, and she couldn't come to the service, and the funeral director had promised he would include a eulogy from her, and then he didn't, and it was all okay. My daughter communicated with her sister-in-law, and she said she was distressed was the perfect word for it, that her eulogy hadn't been included. And I said to Kalisha, we just go down to the funeral directors on Tuesday and ask him if we can borrow the room, and we record it and we send it back to her, and that alleviated the distress until my daughter's partner came home, and he said, you can't do that, that'll upset Michelle and that'll upset Mum, and so he had a level of distress around it, and where there was calm and peace, then Kalisha was all distressed again. So it was those changing circumstances from we can sort this out, and everybody can be peaceful again.
I think that's social distress. I understand it, and that's a form of it. I'm being a bit picky here, in that I'm trying to bring that back down to the individual, to you, in that were things to go okay, you'd never even think about medicine, would you? You'd never even think about doctors. Things would just go along.
Because that's their role, or their perceived.
No, hang on. No, but your experience of it, it is, if life is okay. I don't like AFL saying, right? If I don't like AFL, I just don't bother watching it. I've got no idea who the dockers are. It doesn't really interest me when it comes on the TV. I change channels. It doesn't enter into my sphere of reference. So if I remain well my whole life,
you don't need to go to
I don't even, when it starts talking about the vaccine comes up, will I have the vaccine? Yeah, because I want to go to Borneo. It's not, I'll have it for my health, because that's not an issue. Yeah.
So shaman is just a tool then?
Shamanism.
Yeah, it's just a tool for when you need it, or a framework of understanding
Go on.
the trauma that you're going through.
Yeah.
So you need the shaman the same way as you need the
And
doctor.
he's like a translator.
Yeah.
And I assume
Mentor, a guide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
A medicine man.
Yeah, okay, that's a more nicer way of putting it.
It is, but I'm leading into that so that we understand these terms in a very simple level. Otherwise, we tend to make them a bit abstract.
But then it's more than that, because the shaman needs to have a vision that can see layers of meaning and stuff that's going on with you that you don't understand yourself.
And what gives what I was getting at with Sue was to say, what is it that's giving you that vision though? What is it in the shaman
that you see?
How has the shaman got there?
By experiencing
the same
thing.
Yeah. So the shaman.
All then.
which is called initiation.
Okay, yep, good. Yeah, let's go with that.
It was
See
there,
how it forgets piece,
it
right?
was there on Facebook yesterday for me all along.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, look at it that way. Let's backtrack and sort of say things start to go wrong. You're moving out of this state of bliss, call it whatever you will, equanimity, balance, feeling okay about the world. Something happens. Things start to go wrong. They go progressively wrong. And they'll go progressively, and you'll try and do things about them to just sort of put it right, which are usually just putting it back into balance. Yeah? And they don't work. They do sometimes, if it's relative outer, not a sort of a significant thing for you maybe. But if they don't, they'll progress onwards, you know, sometimes very rapidly, like car accident. You know, it can be very rapid, but sometimes the process, or a little bit slower, cancer. You know, but you've got a progression of processes that's got that, because all of a sudden this person's got cancer. It's been diagnosed. We've got to treat it. But what was the point from when things were actually okay to the time they got the cancer, right? So that process of becoming unwell, becoming diseased, being traumatized, is kind of what is the realm of what we're talking about when we're talking about healing. That's kind of what I'm saying. And what you're saying, which is totally spot on, is that the person who offers the role of guide, mentor, ritual convener in that process has been through it. And the degree to which they've been through it is the degree to which they have an affinity with the person. They empathise. They understand it. And they've gained from their experience what to do about it to help the other person deal with it.
Yeah.
And they've also, in their own experience, have done it in such a way to know that they can't just give formal prescriptive ways of dealing with it. They've got to actually maybe use education, example, or allow them to go through it.
So does that preclude anyone who hasn't been through said trauma from being a healer?
In my book, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in formal shamanic literature, that's the case as well. That the shaman will have been through initiatory experience. Now, there's other elements to this that are important. One is that the difference between the shaman and the person who just uses the shaman services is, for the shaman, it's a vocational thing. So the illness is not only a disorder, the illness is also considered to be an initiation into becoming a shaman as well. So the trauma that they go through isn't just a trauma to get back on the right track. It's a trauma that's saying, we've earmarked you to be the healer. Right? So it's got a further level with it. So in our modern society, what would you say is that if you're seeing someone who, when you've got your heart attack or your cancer, or you've been through your road accident, is you'd rather like someone in that sphere to have experience that they can draw on and help guide you, right? Let me give you an example. When I was in hospital a year ago, the person who helped me most, and I realised in hindsight, I'd engineered myself there. I didn't think so at the time. I thought it was just events, but in hindsight, it was like, you just created this, you arsehole, didn't you? You know, and it's funny how that brutal honesty is really important at times. You know, when we get ourselves in accidents and things, how we actually did it at some level.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Mm-hmm. So there I was, and realising that I was getting what I expected from the experience. One nurse, an older English guy in his 60s, knew what was going on. So I cornered him at some stage. I said, "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" He says, "Yeah, quite a lot." And how much? And he said, "You know, da, da, da." And I said, "So what's going on?" He says, "You want to know?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, let's strip away all the stuff that you've just been told." Da, 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 da. And he just nailed it. I've seen this so many bloody times. And I know what they're doing, and I know it's right, and maybe the drugs will help, maybe this will help, maybe any advice I give will help. Maybe, but he says, but this is what people tell, you know, this is what I pick up about the people who come in here. And he's picking up all these undercurrents of stress, distress, trauma, gradually building up, leads to event, leads to being in the hands of the system. The system only dealing with the practicality, the literal element of what's going on, but not the preceding issues, because they can't, because they haven't been there. He has. I didn't ever get to the point of saying, how'd you get here, mate? But there would be a story, and it wouldn't be my training. It wouldn't be a textbook. It would be something, you know, well, my mother, or when my daughter, you know, or something will have given him. That's shamanic. It's moving around that trauma, wounding territory, not being afraid of it.
He so touches my heart.
Hmm?
My nearly 24-year-old daughter spent 8.5 weeks in hospital. She weighed 40 kilos when she was admitted to hospital. She had low blood pressure, low potassium levels, drives the heart muscle. She was probably, they were doing an ECG, is it, or EKG, or whatever, the one that traces,
ECG.
The one that traces the heart.
EKG if in America, because America's got to be different.
She could have had a heart attack at any time, I think, because they were doing them so often, 2 or 3 every day. You know the story of the trauma that our family went through when we lost Jay to the shark attack, and my sister asked if my daughter could go out to their farm about 30 kilometres away from her family to give her daughter company. And while she was out there, my husband's father passed away. She was very close to him. They were so traumatised themselves that they couldn't offer her any support, and I suspect that trauma was what led to the anorexia in the first place. But to get back to the point, when she was admitted to hospital, there was all that heart rate, blood pressure, blah blah stuff. But we encountered a nurse, and she said to me one day, I said to her, Mel can't sit on the cold bathroom floor. That's just no good. And she said, Sue, it's better than her pacing up and down her nasogastric tube line. She said, all we do is we give her a warm blanket and we sit with her and comfort her. And I found out later her son had travelled the anorexic journey. So she wasn't acting like a traditional nurse taking blood pressure.
No, they don't. And it's just how you can spot them as well. People who do things different.
She was just dealing with that particular thing. She was acknowledging it. She was letting Mel acknowledge it.
You sometimes realise as well that there's far greater things that you're dealing with, like take anorexia. I was, when I was doing psychiatry, we were managing anorectics. My consultant was bringing them in and we were doing this regimen. So I'd see a 40-kilo young lady usually lying in bed and being given the drips or being given the food and being constantly weighed, and you know, all the usual bullshit that goes on with that. And then one day I saw the visitor to one of the girls, who was the mother. And I saw the mother go out and she had a word to me. And I thought, she's an older version of the daughter and she's losing her looks and still trying to be really, really glamorous, and is really scared that her daughter's going to take her place. And the pennies started dropping. So I started looking at every anorectic I saw. And when I saw every anorectic, I had to look at their family structure. Now, that's not saying because there's all sorts of traumas that produce it, but that was for me a particular clue into it. And that clue and me looking for it was because I was going through my own therapy at the time. I was looking at issues in my own background. I was looking at issues about my mother, my father. So I was seeing it in other people. You know, the degree to which I could do anything about it might have been limited, might have been ineffectual at the time. But these are the sort of experiences that occur in a society, and also get people to identify the future shaman. Like the shaman will recognise in the community somebody who is ill, who needs help, somebody who needs help, and somebody who's ill is going to be a shaman. They'll be able to sort of see that quality. And that's what I was talking about. That's one of the qualities that has been recognised in shamanism, is that all shamans are wounded healers. Basically, that's the term for it. In other words, only by understanding your own wounding can you heal other people of their wounding. So that's one of the, and it's initiation. There's an initiation process. And the interesting thing about the wounding is it's not considered to separate off into mind and body. It's both. It's almost inevitably that there is severe psychological distress associated with it. And madness is a very, very common presentation for me of people. And I saw that when I was doing psychiatry. You'd see people doing psychiatry. You see 10 people and you go, mad, 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 mad shaman, mad, 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 mad shaman, mad, mad. There were, every now and then there was somebody whose madness was just had a different quality to it. You know, as opposed to the rest who were retreating, who were hiding. And they were all being dealt with the same. Yeah?
So how do you define madness?
I'm not going to define madness, not at this stage anyway. But madness basically is for me a judgment we make from a particular perspective. It's one that was made from a concrete reality, rational, reality-based way of looking at our lives. If people aren't conforming in that beyond a certain point and are disconnected from it and acting and behaving in such ways that you can't form a connection to it or see it as being meaningful or connected to back to you, they're mad. They're psychotic. But what that means is to be able to understand the madness is you kind of got to go into the mentality, and that means the psyche, the whole psyche of the person who's experiencing it. And there's a classic story that Jung tells. Have you come across that when he was in Bugholsley Hospital? When he was training? He was training as a psychiatrist, and he said that he sat down with someone who was seeing visions, and this is prior to drugs. This is the mental hospital in Zurich. And he said he was still there the next day, 24 hours or so later. They were both nodding like a couple of old mandarins. The guy was still telling, and he was just listening. And he just got totally absorbed in his story. And because he absorbed himself in his story, he could see what was going on for him. You know, when I was doing psychiatry, what I could see was that psychiatrists didn't get involved in the people's stories. They couldn't see their wounding. And very often, the people who are drawn to these sort of trades do want to heal. They've got their wounds, but they aren't given a mechanism to deal with them. So we often see it in them. So we talk about the mad psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, "I'm not mad," you know, or the woman-hating gynecologist, or you know, all these sort of things that we kind of know in our society, you know, about it. That we can see what attracts them, but that hasn't been dealt with in the process of them becoming the shaman. Does that make sense? In an intuitive sort of way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's the empathy that's missing. You're either, if you're a mad, whatever. Not mad. No. So the ones that are dealing with their own stuff, don't have the empathy, but the ones that are the shamans have the empathy.
Yeah.
So that is the missing. That's the.
Which means various things like their ability to face their own.
Yeah.
And empathy is also heart-based. I mean, it's the ability to relate to and absorb what you're listening to. And it's not just at an intellectual level. It has to be, and you and I will know this, we'll all talk about visits to people, doctors, and there'll be occasional doctor. Like when you mention your dentist, it's like, I'll see him. I've been given 3 or 4 opinions. Just because the way they describe it is a bit old-fashioned. He won't do any more than you want. It's like empathy. That's enough. You know, I'll go there. I mean, it may not work, it may not, but that's a start. It's a quality that you do. Yeah, and you're recognising that. You're recognising with what you've been through, is you won't take that trauma to people who don't get it. Yeah. So as initiation, yeah, being through your own madness, which brings in a couple of other things. One is that by their very nature, shamans are usually what's called liminal. They live a marginalised existence. Their experience and what they are working with, because they can't not do it. once they've started, it's a way of life. So it's not like the person who's gone through the same trauma, who's not a shaman. They become healed, go on and become the car salesman, or become, whoever what they're going to be in their lives, the accountant, or whatever, the politician, whatever it might be. But the shaman is constantly working with that sort of area because he's working with it. So that sort of
a calling, yeah, it's a vocation. Yeah. And the illness is considered to be a spiritual calling, that spirit has sent the illness to bring them into being a shaman. And if you abort the illness process, then they don't connect with it, and they probably will die or become a zombie or something equivalent. And we've all known that. We all know people who've got to that particular point with diseases and mental trauma, and they hit a crossroads. And the crossroads is medicine says this way, shamanism says this way, and maybe there's a bit of a combination of both this way. And there's various choices, and people take a particular choice. It's often that sometimes they try and hedge the bets. You see that classically in medicine with disease. I've got cancer, but I'll also see a naturopath, but I won't stop on the chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a mix and match thing rather than a sort of a total commitment to it. So for the person who's dealing with it, they're constantly on the edge. If they stop being on the edge, often the illness process will revisit them. I'm thinking of a word here, and it's the definition of the word. So I'm really struggling with where I work at the moment. I work in education, and I just see nothing but indoctrination.
Mm.
And it's like you have a piece of paper so you could be a doctor, but you haven't been through it. So how does that piece of paper help you? You've learnt it in theory, but you haven't done it in practice. So how do you actually educate? Whereas the shaman educates through experience.
Absolutely. That's true with all, though. I mean, that's not specific to shamanism. Teaching. There's another discipline like that. The teacher who understand, constantly learning, constantly working at the face, that sort of interface, is a person who can genuinely teach and realise what their calling is in that. So it's not unique. Liminality and marginality, though, is kind of the image that we have of the little old mad lady brewing up her herbs, or the druid at the bottom of the garden, or you bring out the rain man when it's time to rain, and then you piss him off when it's sunny again.
But it doesn't bother those
because
people, does it?
Doesn't bother those people, but it can bother people in the community if they're around when things are actually going okay. Mm-hmm. You actually, I in my talks I often do this. Look at the film Excalibur and watch the relationship between Arthur and Merlin, right? Because Merlin's like the shaman figure and the druid, and there's often their interfaces around things, about things like the thing about Guinevere, the trauma, the wounds, the forgetfulness, where lies evil, the constant little interfaces. And where does Merlin go? There's one classic line where he says, "Where have you been?" And he says, "Where have I've been?" He says, "It took 9 moons to get over what I did for you." And what he's saying is, it took me that long, significantly 9 months, but that long to recover from changing his father's shape from Uther into the Duke so he could conceive Arthur. So that he was being questioned by, this is when Uther was questioning him. And he was basically saying, that's what it took me to do what you asked, to bring in the magic so that you could do what I wanted, because I knew that I had to do it for you, blah, 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 blah. So where have I gone? I've gone back into liminality. I've gone back in, I've recovered, I've healed, I've got over it, so I can come forth and do it again. Yep. So initiation, liminal, marginal existence. The belief system is animistic. It's a belief system that everything is in life. It can be polytheistic, the belief that there are godlike entities in our existence, not just one detached, distant God. So it's not just as clear cut as the stone being alive and all that sort of stuff. Although it's that reality itself is animated, is alive. Everything is alive. Yeah. And what you're doing as a shaman is you're working with that. So you'll be working with all sorts of areas which inform you from that. And that they can be, that's where ritual is designed to help that process, because ritual puts your frame of reference in a state where you're more available to receive that sort of information. Yeah. That's where ritual does. Ritual sort of takes you away from your rational mind and puts you more in that state, as do other things like drugs, sleep deprivation, fasting, self-flagellation, lots of ways of doing it. Good sex, lots of ways of actually taking you away from the domination of our rational reality-based existence back into other areas, and connect people with it. And the belief in that is that the healing process will come from the spiritual world by you taking the person to that point where they become healed. So the shaman's not doing the healing, the shaman is facilitating the process. So there's a healing function and all that. But the healing function is based on animism, and the animistic thing is that spirit, if you like, in your words, spirit will heal if you get the other shit out of the way to allow that process to happen. And the reason I mention things like ritual and flagellation and fasting and all the rest of it is that we're actually discovering that neurophysiologically, is that if you make those sort of connections in the brain, then you're getting the brain operating at its maximal efficiency. That we have a real difficulty in human beings being able to connect our instinct and emotional levels to our rational levels. Right? This is where the sort of thorny image of the goddess is so prominent, because that connection demands actually a connection through, mostly in our neurophysiology, through the feminine, so-called feminine side of the right hemisphere of the brain. Yeah. And that's why men often fear women, because they're able to take them away from their capacity to be empowered and controlled by connecting them back to the sort of forces that they need to be whole. But if you do that, you give up your power and you give up your money and you give up, blah. All kind of makes sense, and it's not really all that difficult. Which brings in other things. Another thing a shaman's got is like your tool bag. What you use, your magic wand, runes, or whatever other divinatory mechanism speaks to you. So what have I got down here? Animism, liminality, initiation, healing, and tools. But animism means ensoulment. Animism means the world is ensouled. Liminality. The shaman is a technician of ecstasy. Ecstasy means being able to go beyond the body. The shamanism knows how to use rituals and other tools to be able to do that. Initiation, we've talked about being through your own healing. Tools. What's in my kit bag? Not a lot. I carry a toolkit whenever I go. So when I come here, I've got a very, very ancient plastic box.
Handcrafted by my ancestors.
In Bunnings. $8.50, thanks. Is that pay pass? And that can include clothing for identity. It can be sort of tools, amulets, talismans, and as I said, divinatory tools. Knife, the ubiquitous knife, can be used for sacrifice. Can be used for ritual purposes. Divinatory tools are basically tools that you use to try and facilitate contact spirit. For example, I'd just as you know, with the naming process. The naming process involves, and this is where it becomes magic rather than just allowing spirit. You're actually involving yourself in the process, which for me is kind of the definition. And the difference between magic and mysticism is the magician will actually put himself in the position of mediating those sort of forces and take responsibility for the way in which he does it. Oh, and she, of course.
Is that
Meaning
what
that-
happened here
So,
between you and I? Was that magic?
Yes.
which one?
So we came out here looking for the wood for my sacred object because I thought that's where I was going to find it, and April thought it was hilarious because I found it in my backyard.
Yeah.
But one thing I really learned out here about animism is that if you try to take live wood from a tree, it screams.
Mm.
It screams in absolute agony. I jumped back. I was so shocked because I could hear the scream in my mind, and I knew then, don't touch live wood. Don't cut live wood, don't try to break it because it hurts if you do that. And then I wanted a feather out here as well. I had the idea in my mind. And we went walking all around the property, no feather to be seen anywhere. And I thought, okay, the feather idea is not going to happen. And we rounded the corner. I don't even know where on the property now, but it still gives me goosebumps. And in front of us, there was just this path of white feathers, pure white feathers. And in the middle of it was one feather that didn't fit, which was really quite interesting. And I said to April, Jay's been here. In the meanwhile, April's mum had come to me. I call it thought projection. I don't even know if it's the right word because there's nothing I can equate to a physical voice, but these ideas enter my mind. So I think of it as thought projection. And she told me I could call her Mrs. D, and so that was okay. That's what I called her. And she said, I want to talk to April, and I said, and I had experienced this before with my nephew, so I thought, okay. And after the whole white feather thing, we went down to where the big stone is at the entry to the property, and on the way out, I said to April, this is where your mum wants to partake of what, for lack of a better word, I know is channeling. And so then we had that experience, and she said to April through me, Jay didn't lay the feathers out at all. He's an awesome guy, but he's not going to take the credit for everything. Those feathers were from you, from me.
Mm.
Is that magic?
I think if you see the world as animated or see your existence as animated, then it's everywhere. You know, and it's not necessarily that you need to understand it or interpret it. You know, like I don't do that with dreams, for example, even though I was trained to do that.
You just accept it for what it is?
Oh, it depends. It depends what I want from them, and it depends what my own will and my own intention is. You know,
I don't think I had intention with that. April's mum came to me, she wanted to see April, and I have the capacity to be able to deliver.
I think it's up to each of us to interpret it the way we want, including that there is none. You know, it's just an event, and you don't know its significance. I had an event happen to me 3 days ago, and I don't know the significance of it, but it was obviously meaningful. So I was walking around the property and saw a funny shape on a stump of a tree. And there's a parrot holding onto the side of a tree, 28 parrot, and it appeared a little bit wonky. And I looked at it and walked past, and then I thought, no. So walked back and looked at it again, and then thought, wonder if I can touch it. Touched it, no response. And I thought, well, this is obviously significant, you know. So basically, I picked the parrot up, and the parrot allowed me to put it in the palm of my hand, and thought, no, I wonder where I need to put it now. And now I'm kind of stuck with it. So I've gone and interfered in the bloody web. Yeah.
Believing it.
And then the choice was, well, here I am now. What am I going to do? You know, does this parrot need to? Am I going to come back? Am I going to be feeding this bloody parrot for the rest of my life? You know, so all the stuff that your mind sort of goes into it. And it was like, just walk. And I just walked with my hand open with the parrot like that, and eventually it went about 50 metres down the track. It came to, obviously stunned, and just flew a nice big arc and then flew off. Significance? I don't know. But it was potentially, it was at a significant time of events for me happening.
Is that here or up at?
No, this is a brown up.
No.
Yeah. And I believe that the interpretation was as simple as listen to spirit, and watch what's going on, follow what's happening to you. You know, you've been knocked around, you know, with a couple of events I'd been handling, which weren't in my personal orbit, which I'd taken on board, and being the sort of the healer in this process, I'd probably been a bit more bashed than I realised. I needed to recover a bit. So I effectively took the phone off the hook for a couple of days. Was that right? Was that wrong? Was that magic? Was it not? Be careful about categorising, because I think even when I went through those lists of characteristics, they all overlap. And there's bits and pieces of them that flow into each other, and that'll all be familiar. You know, which is one reason why I feel like shamanism has done us a great tool. And I don't like the separation that's been given to it in academic circles, that the only shamans are the ones from Siberia. You know, that's the true, authentic shamans. Anybody else, of course, is it's crap, really. You know, that's where I appreciate people like Jung, because as we've talked about it today, most of you will have, at some stage, picked up on things or had memories or thoughts or feelings about things that are going on in your life right now as a result of the flow of this conversation. You know, so it defies that sort of category. It's a principle, it's a process. Giving it a name and nailing it down often limits things like that. And for me, it's a principle to say, well, I'm familiar with that. You know, that's not just some funny shaman with a, you know, head of something poking out, blah, 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 who speaks in weird language and forked tongues and does weird rituals. It's me in everyday life can be like that, and I can conduct my life. And hang on a minute, that's probably not a bad way to live your life anyway. So then it starts to fold back into, that's why I also don't distinguish shamanism, say, from Druidry. You know, Druidry is the identification that I give to my own traditional heritage. But you know, as I talked about at the beginning before we started this talk, I'm also keen that what does it mean for a Druid that's supposedly something up in Britain from 2,000 odd years ago, living in Australia right now with the changes the globe's going through. You know, and I feel like there's an importance here now about that, and that the principles of the shamanic and druid principles that I've discovered in that process are probably a language. So Druidry for me is a way of communicating it, and communicating it in a way that people of my own background and similarity will understand. But maybe beyond that, maybe that becomes a language to talk to people from different backgrounds, because they can recognise you've been through your own, you got your feet in your own tradition, you sorted out your own shit. Okay, we'll speak to you, we'll talk to you, we'll listen to you. You know, otherwise, there was I went to a conference many years back in the breakaway country, which is east of Kalgoorlie, and we had various shamans, global shamans. There was a Canadian shaman, there was an Apache chief, and a couple of other people, and an indigenous shaman there. And there was it was quite of interest. It's like something out of a Hollywood movie, because there's 4 shamans that sort of sitting there, and underneath the tree was about 50 to 100 Anglo-Saxon white people of vaguely New Age persuasion, trying to lap up the wisdom, which is lovely. You know, it's better than being conditioned and sort of wearing the bowler hats and all the rest of it, I think. But they were then sort of asking the shamans basically, well, how do we live our lives? That was the big question. You know, and our world's fucked, isn't it? You know, so what are we going to do about it? You know, like, and the Apache chief said, amongst a few other things, he said, there's, you know, a few things that piss me off. One of them, he says, is people who wear eagle feathers who haven't earned them. So that's the first message. So everyone looks around and sees who's wearing eagle feathers. And it's just, other thing that pissed me off is in Western people, it's laziness. He says, you're too fucking lazy. You don't look to your own culture. And he actually identified it as Druidry, which interested me at the time. He says, you've got your own tradition. You just are disconnected from it. Okay, he says, we're fortunate, ours is alive, and we have the lineage and the connection. Yours has been broken. But that doesn't stop you being able to reconnect to it, nor does it mean you adopt another as a substitute. You may learn from us ways of making the reconnection, but it's really important that you make the reconnection yourself. And that, obviously, as you can tell, this is 30 years ago, had a real impression on me. I mean, partly because it sort of supported my belief about Druidry at the time, but also because it pointed out to us that we've each of us got to do our own homework, with that and make those. Because I think that's one of the problems we've got in the West at the moment, is the lack of power. The ineffectual powerlessness is just take the recent stuff with the rape and the woman suiciding. I mean, blind Freddy can see what's going on. And everybody's trying, but are we as a society capable to actually face these sort of issues? And we're rapidly losing it. The day to do it was on the day. If we had a leader of inspiration was to stand up and say, this bloody sucks and it's happened on my post. I've got to do something about it. Instead we've got a salesman who tries to work his way out of it. We lack it, but also we in general are lacking our voice as well. And our voice may not be refusing to have the jab. Our voice may be in other directions. It's not saying we shouldn't do things like that if we believe in them. But what it's also saying is we need to sort of attend to errors as and when they come up. As the way we deal with people day to day in our daily lives. So when the checkout chick or guy says, "How are you today?" you tell them the truth.
How many times do you say, "I'm good," and you
just
really
to say,
suck?
"I'm on a shit day, how's yours?" And you make connections. Last time I did that in Woolies, the woman behind me then struck up a conversation. And she is kind of one of us. So there was that bridging that occurred. In 2 minutes and you walk away and it's nice and probably never see each other again, but you connected with someone.
Yeah.
There was that ensoulment process. That's all embedded in this. It's all embedded in shamanism. And the reason I like Druidry is because I think it talks. That's why Harry Potter is so successful. That's why Gandalf in Lord of the Rings is so successful. I'm not clear that we've really got it yet, because Gandalf is basically a little bit too Christian and asexual, and Harry Potter's a little bit cute and a little bit too magical, but in that you can see that we're looking, sorry?
They're palatable.
They're palatable, acceptable, but beyond that, it shows that there is that desire,
There's a shift happening.
Yeah. I think it's Merlin talking, personally. That's about all I've got to say. Anybody got a few minutes if anybody wants to bring anything up? Ask any questions? Clear as mud?
This sacred objects thing, you can't learn about sacred objects from somebody else, or
yeah, you can, but you still got to work with them yourself and to find out what they mean for you. Why do I use runes instead of tarot or anything else, I Ching, or because they kind of talk to me. I found when I was looking at those systems that they're the ones that did it. So, but you still got to put your trust in it.
I was utterly shocked to find out my sacred object speaks.
Yeah.
I was
But
shocked.
if you look at the literature, look at what I'm saying, that's what you're doing. By becoming ensouled, you are listening to spirit. And spirit's not going to come out with It's not like Moses. You're not going to come back with 2 tablets.
I just kind of thought that I had to do things with my sacred object and traditional kind of things, and I suppose you can. But what I found out is that I go out into my garden and my sacred object sits on my altar, and when I'm close to it, I can start to speak to people that I need to get messages from, and I believe my sacred object magnifies the communication.
Whatever works, whatever system and way you contest, it's fine. I mean, I've got my own, but it's based on my experience, and I wouldn't foist that on someone else. I'll tell my story about it, like I am doing, and give examples, you know. But I beyond that, that's for each person to find out their own way.
I wanted to learn to do things with it. I thought it's a tool. I have to learn things to do with it, but it was teaching me all along. It taught me way more than I could have ever done if I was educated in the use of it. There's just such a personal connection to it.
There's also a trust factor. I mean, that's probably why I like things, putting yourself in a space where you're prepared to receive whatever it is that's given to you. I mean, and I find an element of that is important. Like, as you know, my main past trade has been as a psychotherapist. That was what crucially worked in psychotherapy, is if you create a space and you just let the space talk, something will happen in that space. And that's where you and the soul that you're working with are both in that space and listening. And what merges is from, if you like, in my terms, the objective psyche into your personal psyche, your soul. And has a message, makes sense. Like the bird that flew for me. I mean, that's a very obvious one, but it can be trivial. Most of us miss it. Most of us miss... I mean, one of the other things I learned in psychotherapy is you watch for the pauses, the eyes, the body language, and not in a reading body language way, but just... And you'll know this. You'll be talking to someone and there'll be a gap, there'll be a hesitation, there'll be a little... Those areas is where the gap, that's the portal, that's liminal. That's liminal space. It's not something just out there at that boundary between here, the known world, and the other world. It's the one you move between, you know. I use a metaphor for this, and sort of the things that you've got control over and things you don't have any control over. And you've got to form a relationship with it, you know, about how... And it's about boundaries, it's about how you communicate to it and accept what's given to you. Like in our naming process, we do that. It's like it hinges around drawing a rune. If you've got a bunch of runes and you're sticking your hand in and you don't know what's in there, you've got to somehow make that rune connect with the person who's asked you, you know. It's like, that's the gap. You know, okay, I'm picking it. You know, I'm interpreting it. I'm putting it together. That's the magical component of it. You know, the shamanic component of it. You're putting it into a medicine and not just leaving it as a chance reading. So you're taking something that's chance and making something of it. Otherwise, you miss it. In the Castaneda books, he talks about, Don Juan, the shaman, talks about the cubic millimetre of chance. And he says, you're walking along and you're moving along your life path. And he says, what will happen? He says, the cubic millimetre, he has lovely terminology. The cubic millimetre of chance, meaning it's not very big, right, will pass you by. And you're moving by, and the cubic millimetre, he says, you either go up and go and take and get into that cubic millimetre of chance, or you fucking miss it. And if you missed it, it's gone. If you notice with, some of the TV programs that I'm enjoying at the moment is Doctor Who. Is not all of them, some of them are shit. But some of the writers play around with this, like that Weeping Angels. Plays around with the whole thing of mirroring and reflection. And the reason it gets to people is because it's close. It talks about quantum energy and indeterminacy, you know, and the dark forces that are out there just beyond, you know. And if you don't look, if you're not looking, what do you know, how you deal with it. And that program, I guarantee, would have freaked more people out than the ones about the end of time and the world blowing up and the big crazy monsters.
It freaked me out because my mother-in-law gave me a garden ornament, was an angel. and that night after we watched that, my husband came in and put after I went to sleep, and put the angel on my bedside cover. And when I woke up, oh yeah, I froze.
That's because you weren't. Yeah, you had to because you're looking at it.
Oh boy.
That's grounds for divorce.
He thought it was hilarious.
I bet he did.
Maybe that's what the staffer was using on Brittany Higgins. Do you think?
Oh, yeah, maybe.
The weeping angel, or was it just alcohol?
I think it was just alcohol.
What?
Just alcohol, really.
Oh, that's a mess, that whole area, isn't it? Anyway. Anything else? It also, for me, one of the things, just to finish with that, is that when you start appreciating it this way, I've stopped
Leanne's here.
the kind of the fantasy process of thinking that when you look out there and you think about things like ghosts or flying saucers, that they're real things. That you don't need to see them as being real things, but see them as being the fact that we have such a constricted and restricted view of the world that the only way we can make sense of it is to bring it into our way of looking at it. You know, I'm finding this, I said I wouldn't talk about COVID, but I'm finding out with COVID is we've got, like the weeping angels, something you can't see. And we're bringing it into, and it's creating absolute chaos because we're trying to see it realistically, literally. So we're drawing all sorts of diagrams and creating things to understand it, because it's just one step beyond our ability to do that with. In the same way, we'll never see a flying saucer land here. We'll never see a ghost get up and say, "Oh, I'm a ghost." But each of us will have had experiences like that and know that usually when we have them, we're in a slightly altered state, hence the shaman. You know, we've moved slightly somewhere else. We've taken too many of that funny fungus or whatever it might be. Yeah. Oh, God, I saw real. My gosh.
You know, my dad recently, he's in Clarence Estate with frontal lobe dementia, so you can't reason with him. He's way moved out of the reasoning realm. And he keeps repeating this story from quite some time ago. We scattered my mum's ashes in the creek on the farm where they lived for 33 years. And he keeps telling me, and my daughter must have been maybe about 13 at the time. She has an intellectual disability, so she often lives on the fringe. And he drove in the car with her, or he drove her up to the farm, and we all went in different vehicles. So I never saw the encounter, but apparently almost all the way from Chains Beach to the farm at Borden, she said, "Pop, is Nana a ghost?" And to him, the idea of a ghost is so out there, he's so sciencey based, that he would have said to her, I would have thought no. But he was in need at the time because he'd lost his life partner. So he said, yeah, I think Nana might be a ghost. And it just worked for both of them.
Maybe that's what we should do, is we should take a big bunch of mushrooms to Parliament House.
And have them think they're real ones.
Make it
All right.
mandatory.
We'll wind up there. Thank you, everybody.
Ones.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, Drew.
How many strikes do we get?
Oh, yeah.